Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Define Disaster. This is Battlefield 4. In today's weapon review, we're going to be taking a closer look at the A-91 Carbine, available, of course, to all classes in Battlefield 4. We're going to be covering its stats-based properties, which are actually relatively interesting for a Carbine, if I am allowed to say that. And then we're going to move on, of course, to the best appliance of this weapon, when you should be using it, and how you should be best using it. To start things off, as per usual, of course, we're going to be covering the stats of the A-91, starting off with the damage model, average standard carbine damage model here with a maximum damage of 24 and a minimum damage of 15.4. We've got a fire rate at 800 rounds per minute. That is, I'd say, slightly above average for the average weapon in Battlefield 1. A standard magazine size at 30 plus 1, 31 bullets in total. A muzzle velocity typical for carbines at relatively low at 470 meters per second. Where things start to get a little bit more critical is when we come to reload times. These are relatively long, especially for a weapon that seems more like geared towards close quarter medium range combat, with a relatively high fire rate at 800 rounds per minute, with a short reload at 2.7 seconds. That's with one or more bullets left in your magazine or chamber, and a long reload at 3.35 seconds. That's more towards kind of your average expected reload, but especially that longer short reload is going to get in the way of its close quarter performance, as we will see in just a moment. Moving on then to recoil, with a vertical recoil of 0.3 and a recoil to the left and right of both 0.35. This is a weapon that has, unusually for Battlefield 4, unlike Battlefield 1, equal recoil both to the left and right, and actually relatively equal recoil in all directions. In other words, this weapon is going to kick a little bit, but it's going to kick very predictably in all directions and adjust itself relatively easily. The first shot recoil multiplier isn't too bad, isn't too good. At 2, it means there is a first shot kick to this weapon. However, you should be able to manage it relatively comfortably. Where things once more start to get a little bit more difficult for the A-91 amongst its normal, otherwise very average stats, is the ADS value. At 0.35, this carbine is less accurate than the average carbine, and the average carbine is less accurate than the average assault rifle. At 0.35, you've got almost half the accuracy or double the ADS maximum divergence in degrees per shot base value than that of an ACE-23 at 0.2. Your average assault rifle is 0.2 accurate. This one is at 0.35. This is bad, in other words. Actually, this is even worse than most LMGs out there, which are at 0.3 as well. You want to keep this in mind when trying to go for longer range targets or choosing attachments, as we will talk about a little bit more in just a moment. ADS while moving, on the other hand, is better than your average carbine at 0.635 versus the usual carbine's 0.8, which is in turn better than your average assault rifle, which usually will be sitting at 1 degree of maximum divergence of the bullet. In other words, strafing with this gun while shooting is viable, or at least more viable than it would be with other weapons out there. As such, of course, it's no surprise that also the hip firing is more accurate with this weapon at 2.25 versus the average's carbines 2.5 versus the average's assault rifles 3.5. In other words, you can relatively reliably hip fire this weapon while standing, while moving, while crouching, whatever state you may be in. Hip firing this weapon is an option, at least in close quarter combat. Now, with the base stats of this weapon being covered, let's start getting into a little bit more of the meaty stuff. How does this weapon really perform? Well, essentially, if you're not careful, you may find yourself using a potato gun. At 0.35, the ADS of this weapon is significantly below what it needs to be reliable at medium range. The recoil, however, and the fire rate will be great for medium range, even a bit of close quarter, and even a bit of a long range. You can use this weapon relatively versatile, similar to that you would use an ACE-23 or ACE-21 CQB, to name a fellow carbine. What gets in the way of this is obviously the accuracy, and you're going to have to find some way to combat this, or otherwise resign to using this weapon exclusively in close quarter to medium range-ish, unless you pick certain attachments, which we will get into just a moment. Overall, the weapon's got a mixed bag of stats. That is to say, it's got all right stats most overall. It's got good hipfire, which is nice, but it's also got a serious caveat with its relatively bad base ADS and relatively bad reload times for a close quarter orientated weapon, which means you're gonna have to watch that reload. Yes, of course, the king of close quarter is the FAMAS. It's got a much worse reload, but it's always nicer to have a quicker reload for close quarter. That is to say, it's beneficial because it means you're less likely to get caught out mid-reload. With that being said, let's move on to attachments. When it comes to those attachments, let's start off with the optic. It's going to be a red dot sight Coyote here in this case. As always, for me, if you want to use a different red dot sight, feel free to do so. If you want to use a medium range sight, this could work on this weapon. However, there are certainly better weapons to use medium range sights on. I personally find myself at a disadvantage and have a limited overview of the battlefield when using these sights. So unless I'm using a weapon that is truly designed for long range combat, actually, you won't find me using a medium range sight. And this is no different for the A-91. Accessory is going to be either a laser sight or no laser sight. The choice is yours. You can choose a laser sight if you can switch it off in situations where it gives away your position. We've discussed this many times. The same applies to this carbine as applies to pretty much any weapon that equip a laser sight in Battlefield 4. There is, however, some exception to this in that sense. You can also put a target detector on this weapon because it is a carbine. If you're not going to run a laser sight and you're not going to run a flashlight or any other kind of gadget, a magnifier, you may as well put the target detector on. Frankly, if you're a decent player, you're going to spot the enemy long before the target detector does, but maybe in case you miss one, the target detector isn't going to harm you anyway, so you may as well slap it on if it's not going to be a laser sight. Barrel attachment is where things get, well, I'd say more interesting. Some people are going to use this weapon exclusively in close quarter. Then obviously it's going to be a suppressor, and this is close quarter TDM style game modes, for example. Other people want to use this weapon a little more flexibly, and this weapon can actually be set out to be relatively flexible. You're going to want to put a heavy barrel on here. Frankly, I just found when using this weapon, I was not hitting shots that I clearly should be hitting at medium close quarter range. Targets behind high cover with only the head pointing out, where I was thinking to myself, how are the bullets not landing there? I'm only 25 meters away. Now, my aim in that case wasn't potato, it really was the gun. The accuracy of this gun is simply just bad. You thought using the LMGs is bad, then you haven't used this gun yet. It's even worse, and as such, for me, a heavy barrel is a must pick with this weapon. However, before putting this weapon down the drain, when equipping the heavy barrel, I found the weapon still to be very controllable. That is to say, comfortably controllable, burst tap firing this at medium to long range and still hitting my shots. That may be because I've got a little bit more experience than the average player controlling recoil in Battlefield 4. However, I think most of you guys out there, even the less experienced players, should not have trouble with the A-91 with a heavy barrel on it, because the base recoil of this gun, while not non-existent, certainly isn't too bad. Moving on then to underbarrel, this is going to be the same choice as it always is. Vertical grip, despite this weapon being so very accurate on the move and when hip firing, it can always be even more accurate. And if you slap on a vertical grip and a laser sight, this thing becomes ridiculously accurate at hip firing and becomes a very, very good strafing gun to shoot with. That's to say, shooting at a sniper or any other target that you need to strafe to make yourself a harder target, the A-91 will suddenly become a very viable option to use in that configuration. With that being said, let's come to the playstyle aspect and the appliance of the A-91 on the battlefield. When it comes to this weapon, if you equip it in the way I like to run it, or I find when I equip it with a heavy barrel and optionally also of course a vertical grip and laser sight as well as an RDS, the weapon becomes suddenly very usable, quite good actually, I'd say. Not obviously Ace 23, M416, Scar H good, but good enough to say that I don't feel myself being at too much of a disadvantage when using this over one of those named otherwise good guns. It's a solid weapon. If you don't use a heavy barrel, frankly for me, it's too limiting to use only in close quarter, where I would much rather be running around with an AK, FAMAS or F2000 than this, which just simply have higher fire rates, higher damage outputs, and as such will want to use this weapon more flexibly than those, and as such, if I can't, because the accuracy of the weapon is not good enough, I find myself in situations where my weapon isn't performing to the standards that I need it to perform, and as such become very quickly unhappy. And as such, what I mean by that is basically it's not very good of a weapon unless it's got the heavy barrel on there. Accuracy is a key part of any first-person shooter. If you can't shoot accurately, you're not going to hit your targets, you're not going to have a good time, because you're not going to be getting the kills that you should be getting based on your personal accuracy, but not based on that of the weapon accuracy. With that being said, obviously I'd say this weapon is alright. It's not great. Try it out if you want to. You're not going to be missing out too much if you don't try it out. It is, however, a very good weapon to strafe and shoot or hip fire amongst the carbines, or especially when comparing to the assault rifles. So it's a weapon that you can very well use for run and gun situations, especially when running with that heavy barrel, as I already said, to make it more versatile. Feel free to leave down below in the comments your opinions on the A-91, as well as any future video suggestions both for Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 1. But with that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 4 video.